Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Rosa. I am a queer witch, anarchist, anthropologist, affectional alchemist, committed to healing, justice, and radical social transformation. I'm also a devotee of Babalon, which I nearly forgot, but she wouldn't let me forget. And so let me just share my screen. So I hope you don't mind, I'm just going to be talking for a while and sharing a little bit of like my own magical story and witchcraft journey. Hang on, let me get the slides going. Right, can you all see the slides? Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to give this talk. It's called hex-positive to sex-positive. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about my own magical journey. And it's a story that involves conducting political hexes. It involves kink, Babalon, sex work, healing, and trauma. And so the title, hex-positive to sex-positive, is a little bit binaristic and simple, and it's like way more complicated than that. Wait, can you all hear me okay? Because it says I've got audio problems. It's all good. Okay. So yeah, the story is way more complicated. I feel the title is a bit binaristic and it's all about cycles and overlap, but just for the sake of storytelling, I split it into two parts. So we're going to first start with the hexy stuff, then the sexy stuff, and then hopefully we can have some discussion at the end. Or I'm not sure if we're going to save the big discussion for after Lottie's talk, but let's just see how the time works out. And so this topic, it's not always easy to talk about. There might be some challenging themes coming up, so I like to start, and if you have some available, I invite you to join. I'm going to light a candle and do a little blessing, and I'm also going to read a poem, which is a cut-up from some of my favourite radical spirits, Rosa Luxemburg, Anita Berber, Audre Lorde, and then Babalon via John Dee and the Daughter of Fortitude. So, yes, I'm going to light this candle for the witches of past, present and future. I stand with and beside you in the struggle. Sacrifice your streets before the restless oceans pound. The noon's new fury will rise up again. My sisters, our inflamed revolution is treacherous with old magic, bright like moon silver and dripping with divine dissolution. Embrace the circle of stars, for order is built on sand. Tomorrow, witches in Dahomey turn the sea back and promise futures full of magic and not white. Thanks everybody. So let's begin. And I'd like to start with asking you all a question. Now first, we can talk about it at the end, so I'd just like you all to kind of ask yourself the question. And the question is, have you ever considered hexing something or someone? Now it may have been a shitty employer, it may have been an insidious institution like the police, or maybe you're one of the witches who hex Donald Trump every waning crescent moon. So did you hex someone? Have you thought about it? And if you didn't, you should ask yourself why not? What was your reasons? So just take a moment to think about that. Okay, so this is something that we can keep in mind, the back of our heads, while you listen to what I'm talking about. And I'm asking because over the past few years, there's been quite a growing movement of calls to hex things like hexing the patriarchy, hexing white supremacy, hexing capitalism. And for example, Catland Books in New York City are quite outspoken advocates of this form of magic in the past. they're quite like visible in the media. They did hexes against Brett Kavanaugh and the Supreme Court lately, and whenever this happens, they seem to be the people that are always in the newspapers. And I had the pleasure of visiting the shop once as well, which is pretty cool. But on their website, they have a lot of resources like describing their hexes in case you're interested in learning more there. But so this is my confession. So in the past, I did used to describe myself as a hex-positive Wyddershins Wxtch, with Wyddershins being the direct anti-clockwise direction of like chaos and destruction and turning things around. And so in the past, I've hexed a racist library, I've participated in the hexing of Trump, and I've hexed a shopping mall in Berlin, which you're kind of going to hear about today. And I must admit, at the time when I was hexing, it felt great. It was like I was using my magic to do something that I thought was for the greater good, and it seemed quite like empowering, and I was quite proud of myself as well. I would tell everyone like, oh, I'm going to go and hex this and hex that. But on some reflection, I don't think it's really the best approach. And actually now, it's been over a year now, but I've dramatically gave up hexing and I've taken another path. But even though I'm taking another path and I don't think hexing is probably the best practice for me personally, that does not mean that my magic is still committed to dismantling structures of oppression and white supremacy and capitalism. And I don't judge anyone who hexes. I mean, I can quite very well understand the reasons why they might want to do that. I mean, you just have to take one look at the world that we live in and the injustices faced, particularly for marginalised folks, and see that action needs to be taken. And in my opinion, as white witches, it's very necessary that our magic is used in political struggles for liberation. But as I said, after some experience, I don't think hexing is the answer. So part of this workshop, at the end, I would love to hear if anyone else has any perspectives on these things or has other ideas. And so this is my personal journey that I'm going to share. I don't speak for anyone else. And as I said, maybe some of you are like outspoken advocates of hexing, and I'd love to hear your perspective on what I have to say. But yeah, so because witchcraft is a practice, it means we're going to make mistakes. It means we have to learn from them. So I feel by sharing with you my story and my hexing ways and what I did, which the results weren't very good. I'm just going to admit that. But so I hope that we can learn from the error of my ways. And yeah, I'm still on this journey, so I don't claim to have all the answers, and that's partly as well why I'm excited to hear what other people think and if you have any other ideas. So yeah, we can share our thoughts at the end, but if anyone has like a burning need to share something, you can just drop it in the chat and hopefully I'll be able to see it. Right, so with the introduction out of the way, let's begin with the hexing section, where I'm going to tell you the story of how I hexed a mall for 6 months in Berlin. So, the witch's confession. So, yeah, back in 2020, Geraldine just mentioned it, but I was supposed to give a talk at Conjuring Creativity, and it was going to be called Warschauer Working, or Why I Hexed the Mall. And I was going to tell the tale of how I hexed this shopping mall for 6 months. And I was also, to admit it, a bit preachy. I was going to preach my hex-positive witchcraft practices. But that talk was also going to be a spell, because after I'd spent 6 months hexing this shopping mall in Berlin, I kind of cross-triangulated it, and I also hexed Westminster, and I also hexed Wall Street. And so I did this. I'm sorry to say, my aim was to open a transatlantic hell portal that was supposed to kickstart the apocalypse. And this was supposed to be activated in March 2020. So the conference never happened, because we all know what happened after that. So I'm really sorry about that. And yeah, I'm glad I never gave that talk, and the whole affair has got me to really reflect on my practices. But why did I want to hex a shopping mall? So I just got back from speaking at a conference in Marseille, and my talk was about like these witchcraft feminist movements and how magic has been used in the service of struggles for social justice. And I was particularly looking at like these magical activists in the US who like hexed Donald Trump, and basically my talk was urging people to practice radical witchcraft that's going to dismantle capitalism. But also, and I'm sorry to say, I was kind of shitting on forms of self-care and critiquing it and kind of saying it was capitalist narcissism, which have changed my ways I'm going to talk about after. But yeah, so I got back from this conference. I'd been reading a lot about social movements. I was obsessed with the Haitian Revolution, and I'd also been reading Apocalyptic Witchcraft from Peter Gray, which, for those of you who don't know, it's quite a militant text. It's quite angry, but basically Peter Gray is saying that like witchcraft has been tamed and we need to make it dangerous again. So I've got this quote here from him where it's quite dramatic, like, it's time for witchcraft not to choose, but remember which side it is on in the struggle. This was a time when I'd just been introduced to Geraldine's work, actually, in Topography of the Witch, where she engages a lot with the local landscape, so that was in the back of my mind. And also, this was 2019 when I did the hex, and this was like when Extinction Rebellion were just arriving on the scene, and it seemed like kind of there was a lot of urgency to act, but it seemed like kind of a time of stagnation, but a lot of pressure, and nothing was really happening. So it seemed like the perfect time to just get involved and do something. So I'd got back from this conference, and everything had gone great, but I was just really depressed, and I wasn't sure why. But I noticed that the moon was in the waning phase, and I also noticed that it was like the week before my period, because I am a witch who bleeds, so it was essentially my PMS time. And before this, you know, I was very much a follower of the moon. On the new moon, I planted seeds. On the full moon, I was manifesting, but I'd never really paid much attention to the waning crescent. But so noticing how the moon and my own personal cycle were connected really helped me to kind of understand myself and work with it. So, with this kind of anger in my head, rather than being overcome with this rage and sadness, I resolved that I was going to channel it all into like some baneful, powerful hexing magic. But now, after 1 year of therapy and some reflection, I kind of realised the error of my ways. You know, that probably I should have just sat with my feelings. But back then I didn't have the emotional resources that I do today. And I know that having access to therapy is a privilege that not all witches have. So I'm sure there's many other people who are in a similar situation to how I was then, which is partly why I want to give this talk. So back then, without access to therapy, consumed by depression and rage, I decided to hex them all. So why did I hex this mall in particular? Well, for those of you who don't live in Berlin and don't know it, so this mall, East Side Mall at Warschauer Strasse, for me it became this symbol of like gentrification, consumption, and it really revealed the kind of subtle ways that capital creeps into uncommodified spaces and like alters the way we relate to each other and like change the landscape. So when I moved to Berlin, Warschauer Strasse, it seemed to be a place of great freedom. Basically, there was always loads of punks hanging out there. There were people selling trinkets. As you can see, people playing chess on the street. There are always like buskers playing and big rowdy crowds of people dancing. So I thought it was a real beautiful, fucked up place. You know, it wasn't clean. It was just real. It seemed really like free and alive. And also there was just this big open horizon. So, you know, when someone was playing music and you'd get caught up in a crowd and then you'd look out over the horizon and it just seemed a very freeing space. But slowly, capitalism started to creep in. So in the space where the punks used to hang out, that was the first to be affected, where they completely covered it in concrete and built an unnecessary amount of bicycle racks, which is always empty, but that was just a subtle way to clear them out. Then the train station, which used to have lots of like independent businesses, now has been redeveloped to have a Starbucks. And then came the mall, which completely blocked the landscape and is really neon and disgusting. So it seemed like the perfect target for my magic. And so I hexed them all for 6 months, every waning crescent moon. And so each month, the kind of magic had a similar form, but each was a little bit different. But basically, yeah, on the week leading up to the waning crescent moon, when it was also my PMS time, I would channel all my anger at the world, at capitalism, at injustice, and all the anger at myself. I would channel it into all these magical objects like charging pomegranates. I would make witch treasures and do channeled rants. And then when the time was right, so the last slither of the waning crescent, I would go to Warsaw and I would walk anti-clockwise around the space while hanging my treasures and doing little spells and with my cloak on. I really enjoyed it, actually. And yeah, so I was just doing all this and dreaming the dramatic end of capitalism. And then, so this image here, this is just a collage I made at the time, but the stake became a very important symbol for me. So on this slide you can see, so the very first working, while I'd just decided that I wanted to hex this mall, but I wasn't sure what I was gonna do. And then my housemate at the time, who was a carpenter, just turned up, was like, "Oh, Rosa, I have something for you. You'll know what to do with it." And they presented me with this stake, which was like this big. It was from an olive tree, you know, normally a sign of peace, but it had been struck by lightning, so it had all these black veins and was all charred, and it seemed like a very special item. So on this first hex, I had this on my altar, and every day I was really thinking about and charging it up. And I also in this time channeled this big apocalyptic rant, which I had on a massive scroll. And yeah, so on the first hex, I had the charge stake. And there's a whole story to it where Moon was actually all there. So on the first time, I took this stake into Berghain, which, for those who don't know, is this infamous nightclub in Berlin, which stands directly opposite to this shopping mall. And for me, Berghain is probably, I don't go there anymore, but it seems maybe the closest thing to the witch's sabbat I have encountered. It's a place of decadence and debauchery and completely discombobulating yourself. So I went, snuck the stake into Berghain. I wrapped it up and said it was a present to the people on the door who were like, "What is this?" And then, yeah, dancing with the coven, dancing with everyone, raising the power. And then just before midnight, I slipped out. And so there's these, you have the mall, you have the train tracks, and then on the other side is Berghain, but also some small community gardens. And basically I took this stake, and in the community gardens at midnight, this is where I stuck the stake. I imagined it was kind of creating a protective force field. So I stuck it in at midnight. I could see the mall, and just very magically all the lights on the mall went out, probably because it was midnight and that's when they switched them off, but it seemed very powerful. And so that's what I did. I staked it, went anti-clockwise, and then I went back in Berghain, skipping, telling everyone that capitalism was over and they can thank me. So that was the beginning of the hex. Yeah. But so over the course of 6 months, my magic developed and changed. So I think I'm going to show you some of my little witch treasures now to see. Yeah, so I would in the waning days, I would channel it into like an artistic practice of making little treasures, like these ones you can see here. And then I would hang them at the mall. So here's a better picture of the mall with some of my treasures. These aren't my arms, but a friend of mine went to visit them at some point. Here's some other treasures when I started to use like natural objects. We've got a little hexy pine cone there. What's it? There's one month I made a zine. I think this was one of the last months. But part of why I'm warning against hexing, because I feel it's quite a powerful form of magic that it just took over my life. And I was supposed to only be doing the hexing on the waning crescent days, but when I was making the zine, it took the whole month, and I was just really like, and what's next? Yes, just a little burning stake there. And so my magic changed. So on the first time I hexed, I did it at midnight. I got my cloak. I was trying to be all aloof and mysterious. And if anyone looked at me, I was just like, get away. But by the last one, I was just doing it in the middle of the day, skipping down the street. It's a very busy area. So when people asked me what I was doing, I'd tell them, I'm hexing this mall. And most people are like, oh yeah, way to go. We hate the mall too. So I felt like I was really doing a good thing, and it seemed like I wasn't the only person that had a problem with the mall. But so also in this time, when I wasn't hexing, as I said, I tried to just keep it for the waning crescent days, but sometimes it overtook everything. But so I did spend a lot of time not in the waning crescent days, in these community gardens, like planting seeds and talking to locals and also making little treasures. So here's some kind of antenna that I made. And then you can't really see, but amongst all these herbs is just the stake is sticking out here. Not sure if you can see it there. But yeah, so I was all about the waning crescent and going anti-clockwise, but I was very aware of the importance of going in the other direction because, infinity goes both ways. And ideally, I would have been able to balance it out, but as I said, the hex becomes all-consuming, and it just took over everything. So, what have we got? What happened? Well, let me get a drink before we talk about what happened. So actually, let's go back a minute. While I was hexing them all, if you can see this space here, so this was supposed to be the main entrance to the mall, which in the time I was hexing it, they were having terrible issues with planning permission and couldn't open this entrance, and it was always delayed. So I was like, the magic is working. But then after this, I was going to the US to study abroad. So I cross-triangulated the hex. So I took my little hexing kit, which you can see in this bottom right corner. And I went to Westminster and did the same again. I had a mini stake. Went in the middle of the night, walked anti-clockwise around Westminster, stuck in the stake. And then in New York on the waning crescent moon, I went to Wall Street and did the same, stuck in a little stake and walked anti-clockwise to open this transatlantic hell portal. So we know what happened with that regard. COVID happened, exactly when I wanted the spell to work. COVID tore across the world, causing much death, horror, and destruction. And with them all, where's my little So for those of you that don't live in Berlin, you won't know what's happened. But so this is where the mall is. If I don't know if this GIF is working, but basically, let's see. So they've built the worst thing imaginable. They built the fucking Amazon tower in the space where I was doing the hex. So here's another picture of it. It's fucking massive. It's probably the worst thing that could have been manifested in this space. And so, of course, I'm not narcissistic enough or believe I'm powerful enough that I caused COVID, you know. And in my defense regarding the Amazon Tower, because I was feeling really guilty about that, but I did some research and apparently they had decided, or like it was approved at the end of 2018. So I started hexing this space like 3 months after. So, you know, maybe I sensed it, but nevertheless, this whole thing encouraged me to really like reflect what kind of energy was I putting into the world. What exactly did I expect to happen by wishing a transatlantic hell portal to open? You know, it was just very unreflected. And what else did I have to say about that? Yeah, it just made me feel really regretful. But I like this picture here. This is from Black Friday, a couple of days ago. And so this Amazon Tower now has become a place of protest. So people like beamed that on there. So maybe there's some hope. But I feel very regretful about that. So that is the hexing section. Now, before I steamroll on ahead and we get to the juicy parts, does anyone have any questions? I also, on my YouTube, so from my hexing days, I do have a lot of videos where I talk about in more detail about the mall and also like my hex-positive political practice. So, you know, if you want to get the full talk, you can have a look there. But again, it's just me talking. But so, shall I just continue? Okay. How are we doing for time, actually? I'm not late. Okay, good. Right, let me drink something. Okay, so the sex positive part. So there is this quote, "A witch who cannot hex cannot heal." But what I've learned on this journey is healing is harder. It's messier, it's harder, and it's more important. And also this quote comes from Susanna Budapest, who is a notorious TERF, and so still to this day. And so I feel that then this quote is very telling of what holding on to kind of all this hate-filled practices can make, I don't want to say poison your mind, but it can lead to further violent thought, I feel. So, from hex positive to sex positive. So, after all the hexing and during the pandemic, I embarked on a kinky journey. It's one that involved sex work and falling in love. The two aren't directly connected, but inherently intertwined. And it was in this time that I really got to know Babalon as well. And so before this, in like the hexing days, in theory, I was sex positive, you know, welcoming all types of bodies and forms of pleasure. But in practice, especially when talking about myself, I kind of again saw it as like self-indulgent and a distraction from the real work. But now I realise I had completely neglected my own inner landscape. And that was what was really missing from my magic, was this kind of heart-centered practice. So rather than screaming at a mall, which doesn't really do very much, I needed to connect to my inner fires and tap into like erotic power, which is empowering, it's embodied, it's pleasurable, it's a source of strength and resilience that we can all tap into. Or as the great Audre Lorde describes it, the erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. The erotic offers a well of replenishing and provocative force to the women who do not fear its revelation, nor succumb to the belief that sensation is enough. And yeah, since tapping into my own erotic power, I feel I'm a better listener. I've got more compassion, more empathy, and more resilience to face, struggles of injustice. But this journey and tapping into my own erotic power and this kind of sex positive journey it's not all glitter and sparkles, let's say, and I think some readings of Babylon are all this surface level glamour, but there's also, the more challenging emotions, let's say. And so, going on this journey, it revealed all my shame, my trauma, my shadows, and my vulnerabilities. Basically, everything I'd been avoiding by screaming at them all. And I realised that I had no choice, especially in the pandemic, but to sit with these uncomfortable feelings and face them head on. And I realised that is the more important work that needs to be done. But basically in that time I completely unravelled, and I'm still only putting the pieces back together. So this is also why I'm inviting people at the end to share their practices. But so now I'm just going to go through a few pleasure-centred practices that I've been doing myself, and also some members of my coven have been doing. And so at the end, if you have any more that you'd like to add to the list, I welcome you to share. So for me, this poem that I read was a little taster of it, but I've been connecting with the radical spirits of the city of Berlin. So we've got Rosa Luxemburg, Audre Lorde, who was there for quite a few years, and also Anita Berber. And so when I'm trying to assess my magic and my personal practice, I try and find this sweet spot in the middle between Anita Berber, for those who don't know, is like a decadent, debauched, naked, queer dancer. And then Rosa Luxemburg, who's like a radical revolutionary. Then Audre Lorde, who's the black warrior, poet and healer. So I feel like trying to find the sweet spot in the middle is quite a good practice. And some things I do is like, oh, that's a bit too much on the Anita scale, I need to tone it down. Or that's too Rosa, bring it more to the middle. What next? We've got the pleasure container. So the book from Adrienne Marie Brown, Pleasure Activism, been very important for me and some members of my coven. And so this quote from her I really enjoy is like, to really transform society, we need to make justice one of the most pleasurable experiences we can have. And like looking at her work and reading this book really made me realise that this kind of healing and pleasure is very important to transforming the world, and it's not just like self-indulgent things. It's actually very worthwhile and can contribute to our collective healing. So a little practice that me and my coven have been doing on the new moon is getting together and sharing kind of monthly commitments to certain pleasure practices. So I think one person's was always saying yes to things, someone else was moisturising. Another friend of mine has the M&M routine, which is masturbation and meditation every day. And so my path, basically, one of my intentions was to use a yoni egg that a friend got to me that was made of black obsidian, because a lot of my personal journey is about healing trauma, so it's very good for that. And so the yoni egg, while I was preparing this talk, I was thinking that maybe I probably should have buried an obsidian yoni egg at Wall Street and Westminster at the mall instead. It could have been maybe a different kind of power. But so I found very useful working with this book from Gabby Herstick, which I'm working through at the moment, which helps working with shadow, shame and kink and connecting with your highest sexual self. And it's very practical. And also the text is written in red, which is just very aesthetically pleasing. So this using this yoni egg and also working with Babalon been actually turned out to be a very pleasurable experience. And it's made me think, like, within the Babylonian discourse, it's a very male perspective, but I want to hear, like, more queer and femme perspectives of, like, engaging in pleasurable activities with Babylon and other spirits, because they never really hear about that from but it's very like white male dominated. And so on that vein, I very much enjoyed discovering the work of Amidali, who is a femme practitioner working with Babalon. So we got this quote from her, which is a bit long, but she's talking about Babalon as a wellspring of feminine sexual force. So she uses the goddess Babalon as a starting point for an exploration of the stakes of feminine embodiment, essentialism, anti-essentialism, and the different ways in which sexual magic and art may be used to formulate new and radical visions of femininity and the erotic. And so there's a great lecture with her on the Witch Cabik collection of lectures that, for those who don't know, I'd recommend checking them out. I need a drink, I'm getting all hot and bothered. Okay, what's next? So another way is supporting and enjoying queer witchy porn. So here we've got a few shots from Four Chambers, which is created by Vex Ashley, who's a very sexy Babylonian creatrix. And I actually discovered her work through the Instagram of Georgia Van Relt, who is another key femme contribution to Babylonian discourse. And for example, the Birth of Venus from Four Chambers, it's so sumptuous and erotic and queer. A definite must watch, and I would highly recommend. And oh yes, this is a new one I added, so Skinship Berlin. So I've just started following these. So basically in the month of December, they're doing 21 days of self-pleasure, kind of a queer pagan advent calendar of self-pleasure practices, which you can listen to. And so there's a different practice every day, and it's from queer, trans, non-binary, femme practitioners. And so there's lots of different ones to try. One is called Cruising the Orgasmic Gates. There's a renaming the genitals ritual, and also some sex magic things to listen to. So I'd highly recommend checking that out if you're interested. And last but not least, therapy. So I've really appreciated going on the therapeutic journey and, doing EMDR for trauma processing and also internal family systems. So both of these tools have been very helpful for my day-to-day life and sitting with the shadows and learning to communicate with all these different parts of myself. However, as I said, therapy is not accessible to everyone. And also, what I've learned is that there's nothing wrong with being angry. And in fact, when faced with the injustices of the world, it's quite a reasonable and sensible emotion to be feeling. And I think to deny that, the anger is, delving into this dangerous realm of toxic positivity, which is not useful to anyone. And also, even though I've done all this work, the call of the hex still whispers in my ear, it still sometimes seems attractive. So the question remains, what do we do with our anger? What do we do with our rage with the system and all these injustices? And so I like this idea of reframing the hex. Because, in the system of neoliberalism, our struggle, our pain and marginalisation is very much individualised. So the struggle is seen as your own personal failure, and it isolates us from each other, rather than noticing how a lot of the struggle is caused by systems of capitalism, white supremacy, ableism, sexism, patriarchy, and all the insidious things that permeate our world. So I like the idea of reframing the hex, going from individual struggle to collective transformation. Because I feel that's what the Witches' Coven is all about. It's getting together, it's venting, it's crying together, it's healing, and collectively trying to turn the hex around and reframe it and turn the spiral around. So, I believe that we shouldn't ignore our anger, we shouldn't suppress it, but we have to come up with creative ways to transform it. And so this is the questions that I have for you all today. So we've got, how can we practice a radical witchcraft that's accountable and effective without reproducing violent structures of oppression we wish to dismantle. And can't really read them because everyone's screens are like in the way, but I'm sure you can. What pleasure-based practices do you include in your magic? What pleasurable practices can we use to combine healing with collective transformation and social justice? So I'm not sure if you have any questions, or I'm not sure what time it is either, whether we can start the discussion, but I'll just say thank you for listening. Oh.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I lost everyone's screens there. Thank you so much, Rosa. One thing I was just thinking while you were talking, because I'm aware